Professor, you're muted.
So I'll repeat myself. Good afternoon. This is Issues in Environmental Science, week 6, and we're continuing our discussion of ecosystems and living organisms. Some of this material is covered, or a lot of this material is covered in chapter 5 of the Hossenzahl textbook. I'm going to pick a couple of issues and go more deeply into them. I'm going to try to move quickly because I want to leave sufficient time for our breakout groups. So our activities for today, we're going to be talking about evolution and the tree of life, interaction between species and coevolution. And then in your breakout sessions, you'll be answering additional questions that stem from your reading of the Millennial Assessment Project and the concept of ecosystem services. I'm going to ask you to look for, as a group or as a team, to look for ecosystem services in each of the different categories of ecosystem service that's laid out by the Millennial Assessment Project, and pick one that benefits Florida. And then I want you to do a little research and look into how the current administration has proposed or implemented changes in the evaluation of the cost and benefit for the Environmental Species Act, for the Clean Waters Act, and for other environmental regulations. One of the things that has been done is to sort of change the equation for how cost and benefit is evaluated, such that the benefits of preserving species has been diminished and the cost of doing so has been increased. At least that seems to be the burden of that, and I'd like you to consider that, and we'll try to have time for team presentations and discussion when we finish. Okay, so we talked yesterday, or Tuesday rather, about stress and tolerance, and we were saying how the organism's ability, or individual species ability to tolerate stressful conditions determines where individuals of that species will be able to exist within a habitat. And this is a kind of an extreme example, the hydrothermal vent system with these high temperature tolerating worms that make a living by grazing bacteria off the surface of this hydrothermal deposit. As you move away from the edge here where the hot water is coming out, the density decreases, the density increases rather, and the species which is dominated here by these alvinellid worms gives way to other species which are less temperature tolerant. We can also notice as we look at this that there are some distribution patterns here. The real one is that there seems to be more or less even spacing amongst the alvinellid worms, and that's an indication of how much area each worm needs to get enough bacteria to support its life. And so this makes us think about distribution patterns, and I suggested that distribution patterns, where there was an even distribution pattern, or regular spacing among organisms, among individuals and the species, would suggest that there's a competition or limited resources that don't let the organisms cluster more closely together. So those distribution patterns can be very helpful when we're trying to understand the way in which stress and tolerance and adaptation determine the spacing of individuals within a community or an ecosystem. So there's other ways of expressing or considering the kinds of species that live in a community. And there are specific quantifications or metrics that scientists use to evaluate how species are comprised. And so we can consider two communities. These are, of course, hypothetical communities, in which you can find, in both of these communities, you can find the same number of species. There are 10 different species represented by these little cartoons of the heads of the species. So both of these communities contain the same 10 organisms, the same 10 species in different numbers. And the upper example here, again, this is hypothetical, you can see that this community is dominated by one species, namely elephants, whereas the lower community here has got elephants present, but there's a greater diversity of other species found there. And so you know, this is showing us the global view of these two hypothetical communities, how would we come to understand, or how would we come to recognize, you know, such differences if they occurred in nature? And what we can't, very rarely do we have a sort of a global picture of all of the organisms and the ability to count and enumerate all the different species in that community at once. So not being able to do that for large areas, what ecologists are limited to are taking samples. And so if you can imagine taking a sample at random of species out of this community, you can see that if we selected groups at random from community A here, we would have to take many, many samples before we found all 10 of the species which we assume are present here, okay, or which we specify are present here. Whereas if we were taking random samples from community B down here, we would have to take fewer samples in order to get to the, in order to discover that many species were present. And this, this can be quantified, the number of samples necessary to come up with a best picture of how many species are there, can be expressed as the evenness, the diversity, and the dominance. So diversity is a specific measure, and when diversity is used by ecologists, it's used specifically to understand how many species are present and then how dominant the individual species that are there. So there's a lot more that can be presented under this topic, but this should give you an introduction to the concept of ecological measurement as a way of characterizing different communities. And why is this important? Why would we want to know this? Well, consider, again, in this hypothetical example, what would happen if there were a disease that was fatal to elephants, or if poachers or some other mortality process entered into the picture that was systematically killing off elephants. Well, the community A would be much more greatly impacted by such a disease and much more rapidly altered than community B, where there are fewer elephants present. And so this kind of consideration, just understanding the diversity and the dominance of different species, can help us understand how environmental challenges, whether by disease or changes in climate, can affect the viability and the composition of different communities. Okay, so we've been talking about species, and we've been throwing this term around, but let's sort of delve into what we mean by species and how it is we can use our understanding of species to get at deeper questions, such as how they arise and how they change. And so the idea of describing organisms in a very specific way was originally developed by a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus had the job of describing, or took it upon himself to describe flowering plants. And he developed a system of description that was very detailed and very exact. And specifically, he was looking at the sexual organs within flowers and other characteristics of the plants. But he would use very precise descriptions of the morphology of these organs or these components of the plants to come up with a description of the plant that was unique to that species. And in doing so, he found that there were groups of species that more closely resembled to each other. And so he developed a process, a hierarchy, which we call the taxonomic hierarchy, which sort of codifies and regularizes this way of understanding how species are similar or different from each other. And so here's an example. This goes through the taxonomic hierarchy. So in the uppermost level here, we're seeing different groups, different kingdoms of organisms. More on that in a minute. So if we decide that we're trying to classify an organism, in this case, we're going to try to classify these flatfish down here. And so, you start at the top. What kind of an organism are we looking at? Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Is it a bacteria? Well, no, this is an animal. Well, within the animals, what kind of what kind of group can we find? And of course, there are many different types of animals, and these animals can be described with very specific sorts of characteristics. The species that we're trying to classify is a member, so this is the kingdom, and then we look for the phylum. The phylum is Chordata, and within that phylum there's a subphylum, Vertebrata. So the animal that we're trying to describe is a vertebrate. Okay, well, what kind of vertebrate is it? Well, we then go down to another more precise description, and we reach the class Osteichthyes. Osteichthyes is the class of fishes, bony fishes specifically. And then you step down again, Pleuronectiformes. This is the order of flatfishes. And within the flatfishes, there's a family, Pleuronectidae. Within the family, there's a genus, Glyptocephalus. And within the genus, there are 2 species. So that taxonomic hierarchy, kingdom, phylums, class, order, family, genus, species. So King Philip came over seeking fortune, I think, is the memory device. So that's the basic idea of how species are classified. And in classic taxonomy, the individual characteristics that differentiated these species was almost entirely based on morphological characteristics. Well, that worked great for Linnaeus, and that worked pretty well for flowers, but we'll see that there are problems with that because there are very often species that resemble each other very closely but turn out to be different. So, but let's, before we discuss that, let's look at in a little bit more detail of how we make these broad classifications. Because it turns out that the current configuration, in which there are 6 kingdoms, bacteria, archaea, protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia, giving them in their Latin tags. And that's one thing that should be said about the classic taxonomy. Of course, Linnaeus, as most educated people in his time did, wrote all of his works in Latin. And so these Latin descriptors are held over in scientific nomenclature, and so we still see these Latinate kinds of words to describe different creatures. Well, the present configuration of 6 kingdoms is actually a fairly recent development, and the way in which these species are, these groups are differentiated from each other has undergone a variety of research. And I'll talk particularly about the splitting of the sort of microorganisms into bacteria and archaea, because that turned out to be a pretty important sea change or paradigm shift in understanding taxonomic trees. Okay, so these are the different groups. They all have different characteristics. And so these groups separate all living organisms into these basic categories. And in the book, you get this idea that these categories develop through evolution as a result of sort of this differentiation. So there was a common ancestor of all life, and we really don't have a whole lot of ideas or a lot of clarity about what this was, except that it was single-celled and that it was able to tolerate the extreme conditions that were present when life was first evolving on Earth, something like 2 billion to 1.5 billion years ago. So bacteria were thought to arise first, and then at some point in the course of evolution, another group of microorganisms, single-celled organisms, separated themselves from the bacteria and pursued a different evolutionary history. And then there were further differentiations. Protists are single-celled organisms, but they possess cell walls and internal organelles, sort of more complex single-celled organisms. And then there are plants, which are the first, sort of one of the first occurrences of multicellular organisms, and fungi and animals. Okay, so this is and so, looking at a tree like this, one thing that, so we human beings are members of the Animalia kingdom. And if we look at a tree like this, or any tree, tracing backwards shows how related we are to different groups. So animals are more related to fungi than they are to plants. And the reason for that is they're thought to have differentiated evolutionarily at a later time than fungi separated themselves from plants. And when we look all the way back to the bacteria and archaebacteria, archaea, it would appear from this tree that we are more related, human beings are more related to the archaea than we are to bacteria, which is it's a way of using this tree to see how related things are. So these trees are a fundamental tool for understanding how evolution evolves, or how evolution takes place. And so there are many, if you get into the literature, there are many examples of trees of life that sort of help us understand this. And so, you know, here is that tree of life. That previous one I showed you was from the book. And then there are other ways of expressing this. And the basic idea is that you have these different lines, and then within these kingdoms, there's other kinds of evolution that takes place. So if we differentiate animals from fungi and yeasts, then there are some major branches that occur. And we talked about the Pleuronectes as being vertebrates. Well, vertebrates are a very late comer in the a very late comer in the evolution of life, relatively speaking. Okay, so this is sort of a classic tree that's incorporating more than just the kingdoms, it's incorporating the phyla, and so this is the picture that's present. Well, again, a lot of this understanding of how organisms evolved or are related to each other is was based on morphology. This began to change when scientists developed more sophisticated ways of understanding how life actually does evolve, and how genes are passed from one form to another, and such that you can over time have a rise of different groups, different phyla, different taxonomic classifications. And I should say that the first tree of life was drawn by Darwin. So this is a little sketch that was found in the margin of his notes on the origin of the species. And he's already, and it's pretty clear, he's already thinking about the relatedness between A, B, C, and D. And according to this this diagram here, B and C are more closely related to each other than C is to A or D is to A. So Darwin in 1837 is already using this concept of how the time course of evolution is going to confirm the relatedness of different species. Okay, well, we can keep going. There are other forms here. This is from the Evolution of Man. This is late 19th century. So this is another sort of attempt at broadly classifying all the organisms. Well, this sort of classification works fairly well for multicellular organisms, for metazoan life or plants, but it works less well when we think about the precursors of multicellular life, namely the bacteria and archaea. This became apparent to a very great, very important microbiologist named Carl Woese. And Carl Woese was the first to recognize, he began examining not the DNA, but the RNA, particularly a type of RNA called 16S RNA. And in doing so, he discovered that there were classes or categories of single-celled organisms where that they had very different characteristics from classic bacteria. And so he proposed, to a great deal of scientific acclaim and controversy, that there was this separate kingdom. So he split the bacteria from the archaea. So this was and this is represents another attempt to try to understand the tree of life. Well, one of the sort of basic concepts of evolution is that a species possesses a genome which comprises a set of genes, and that set of genes is unique to that species. Now, if that species, due to evolutionary pressure, separation of two populations into subgroups that continue evolution and face different sort of evolutionary pressures, and then eventually determine into different species, well, they both started with the same set of genes, and they divided them out, and different sets of genes became dominant in the different species. Okay, so that's a concept. But what turns out when you look at bacteria, that they're far more sharing than our invertebrates. And it turns out that bacteria can actually pass genetic information from one group to another. There's a lot more sort of freedom in the tracing of bacterial characteristics. And so different groups of bacteria turn out to have inherited different gene clusters from other bacterial species or other bacterial groups that are very dissimilar and may have had very different evolutionary origins. So this concept of horizontal gene transfer, suggests that this classic picture of the evolutionary tree, the tree of life, is really pretty incomplete, and certainly in the case of the bacteria and archaea and single-celled organisms. And so in more recent scientific literature, where they start drawing the tree of life in more complex forms. And I should say that in present day science, there's a whole practice of genomics, or sometimes it's shortened to be omics, and scientists who use omics to understand different groups of species, to study in particular bacteria and try to understand what sort of functional properties different bacteria have. They base this not on the morphology of the bacteria, which is not very helpful at a microscopic level, but on the genetic code, the genomes of the individual groups that they're trying to study. And so there's a huge movement, very well coordinated, where different laboratories will describe the DNA, the genome of a particular bacterium, and then they'll post that information into a massive online, international database, and other scientists, completely outside of their laboratory, can look at their results and compare them, to the global turn. And as we do this, we sort of see that this, that the branches of certainly in the bacteria and the archaea, that the branches of life, don't sort of follow unique courses, that they're much more interdependent. And so here's a tree of life in which the eukaryotes, which is all the plants and the animals, the multicellular things, are represented as a tiny branch coming off from the group that that became the archaea. So the archaea separated themselves from the bacteria in this conception here, and then at some point, very, very long time ago, eukaryotes developed, and so somewhere in this this branch of this very different looking tree, human beings and vertebra and our flatfish would be located. Okay. And so the tree of life, could also be a coral of life. And I use the word corals because the branching of corals, particularly soft corals, Gorgonia, the branches can very often merge back together. And I think that conceptual idea of evolutionary branches being able to merge together and then diverge later on is a more realistic way of describing how bacteria and archaea are actually interrelated. Well, the story is even more complex than that, because if we think about how organisms are related, it reveals that some of the groups that we think of as being sort of unique unto themselves are actually the result of relationships that occur deep in evolutionary past. So in the book there, they talk about the different interactions, and here I've comprised a table for you, looking at the different types of interactions, and you understand what I'm showing this in a second here. So these are the descriptions of different types of interactions among species, and the two species in question are A and B, and so what's the result? Well, in neutralism, there's sort of the interaction of the species is simply incidental. They may occur in the same place at the same time, but they have no effect one on the other. Competition, two species competing with each other, either they divide the habitat, or one wins out over the other, or one loses. Competition, and we saw how competition, for example, in Tuesday's lecture, how competition produced the zonation of the barnacles on the rock, the tidal rock that I showed you from the Pacific. Inhibition, B inhibits A. Parasitism, there's a parasite and there's a host. And so it benefits the parasite, and the host it loses out. And so, we derive no benefit from mosquitoes or tapeworms, but they benefit from by parasitizing us. Likewise, predation is a more complete form of interaction, in which the predator completely consumes the prey. So there's nothing left. Now, these are sort of all one-way streets, but it's possible to imagine different kinds of species interactions that produce positive effects or positive benefits for both. And so there are different examples. Mutualism, A and B benefit, but they're not exclusive. And then in symbiosis, A and B benefit each other, but this is an obligate relationship. In other words, the symbiosis is necessary for life. So now an example of mutualism, and this is put forward, is the clownfish and the anemone. And this is a classic description. I'm pretty sure everybody knows about this from Finding Nemo. The clownfish lives in anemones, with anemones, and it's immune from the sting that the anemones produce, and it cleans up stuff, and maybe even lures things into the anemone's tentacles, and it benefits by being protected from other organisms by the stinging tentacles. So they're mutually beneficial, but the anemone can exist without a clownfish, and the clownfish can survive without an anemone. In symbiosis, the relationship is much more interdependent, and the classic example of symbiosis would be coral reefs, in which there are dinoflagellates, zooxanthellae, that live within the coral tissue, and the zooxanthellae perform the function of photosynthesis, and the organism that's the coelenterates that's providing the tissue and the skeletal receives the benefit of that photosynthesis, and it offers the dinoflagellate a place to live. Well, when coral bleaching happens, when the temperature exceeds the range that the symbionts can tolerate, it sometimes happens that the corals will expel the dead or dying zooxanthellae. And we call that process coral bleaching. Now the coral can continue to live, and sometimes they can recover, and the dinoflagellates can return, and the corals can be restored to health. Other times they can't, they die. But the two species can live apart, but they really don't function very well unless they aren't together. There's also forms of commensalism, and we can see examples of commensalism every day walking through the FSU campus, when we see Spanish moss and ferns on the branches of the beautiful live oak trees on campus. So the ferns and the live oak and the Spanish moss benefit from the substrate of the the branches of the oak tree. They can put their roots down. They can be exposed to sunlight, and there's really no harm done to the oak tree. Although I suppose you could consider that the extra weight of the Spanish moss, might be some kind of a parasitic effect. But these are examples which would best be classified as commensalism. Okay, well, it turns out that these symbiotic relationships talk about, I want to talk particularly about symbiosis. So symbiosis, there are processes in evolutionary history which indicate that symbiosis has more interesting and diverse implications from what we might naturally think. So let's first remind ourselves of the different kinds of interactions that we have. You've seen this picture before, talking about synthesis. And so photosynthesis, autotrophic metabolism is, of course, a very central and important function of a ecosystem, locally or globally. And the most dominant form of autotrophic reactions are green plants with their photosynthetic bacteria. Well, the photosynthetic bacteria is a little clue here. So before there were green plants and before there were bacteria, blue-green algae they're called, and blue-green algae developed the cellular mechanisms of photosynthesis before there were green plants. So how do green plants end up with, so that's one question, and I'm going to get to how green plants are able to perform photosynthesis in a second. But then there's a second form here, which is chemoautotrophic interactions. And the key thing here is that this synthesis reaction in which CO2 and water are combined to produce sugar, and then oxygen is a waste product, this is the energy in this case comes from light, from sunlight particularly. Well, this equation, this synthesis equation can also be driven by organisms that use different forms of energy. And the simplest expression of this is the chemical energy, which can be derived from oxidizing, from reducing from oxidizing reduced compounds. So hydrogen sulfide is a reduced compound. If it's combined with oxygen, you get sulfide or sulfur, or elemental sulfur, or sulfate. And in the process of doing so, an oxidizing reaction typically produces some energy. Well, that energy can be used to drive the cellular mechanisms that produce that synthesize sugars, just in the same way that the energy from the sun in green plants can produce sugar. Okay, so all synthesis operations need some form of energy. The dominant form of energy in the present ecosystem is sunlight, but there are very important and very widespread organisms that can also perform the same function based on chemical energy. And so chemoautotrophic bacteria are able to synthesize new organic material using the energy derived from oxidation reactions. Okay? So, well, how did all this happen? And here was another revolution in, so Carl Woese, one of his close colleagues and collaborators, was a woman named Lynn Margulis. And Margulis was a really revolutionary, radical thinker. And she took a look at green plants and recognized that all of the processes of synthesis that are necessary for a green plant to produce sugar actually take place in a specialized organelle within plant cells. And this organelle is called the chloroplast. So the chloroplast, and the chloroplasts are green because they have this pigment, chlorophyll pigment, and it's the chlorophyll pigment that enzymatically enables the autotrophic reaction. Well, Margulis looked at this and thought that these organelles were very similar to blue-green algae. And so she also used some of these 16S RNA data to confirm this, and other sorts of genomic information was used to confirm this. And so she proposed that in the distant evolutionary history, as plants were beginning to emerge, they developed symbiotic relationships with blue-green algae. And that over time, these blue-green algae lost the ability to reproduce independently, and they became organelles. And so the chloroplasts within a plant cell have a independent genetic makeup. And so the green plants, which started out as some kind of a symbiotic relationship, eventually became codified or fixed as chloroplasts. And so this theory, which was very revolutionary and widely discredited in the 1970s, is now pretty much universally accepted. So Lynn Margulis was a real pioneer. She also had some other ideas that were, have been less successful, but this was a true contribution and something very original to her. Well, let's continue our discussion of chemoautotrophy, and I'll bring up the example of hydrothermal vents and these tube worms. And I think probably just about everyone has seen hydrothermal vents on television. They're very often covered. And these tube worms are a very prominent feature of chemosynthetic communities. Well, the first discovery occurred at a site in the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Islands called Rose Garden. And Rose Garden was explored specifically because geologists and geochemists were trying to confirm the existence of hydrothermal processes. They were trying to confirm that new seafloor was being generated at a spreading center, and that this process of new seafloor generation would produce interactions between seawater and hot magma. And so in 1969, an expedition was launched to the Galapagos Islands, and they put the submarine Alvin over the side, and they were exploring areas where they were pretty sure they would find, some of this hot fluid coming out as the spreading center reacted with seawater. What they were not expecting was to find abundant life. In most of the deep sea, there's lots of life, there's a lot of diversity, but the life is almost exclusively microbial or very small. They're organisms, they're metazoans, but they tend to be very tiny and to live mostly in the mud. So it was a great shock when the scientists looked out of their window and they saw fields of these tube worms, huge biomass, and also clams and mussels and other types of organisms that were totally different from anything that anyone who had been exploring the deep sea previously had understood. Well, there's a long story about trying to understand how chemosynthesis worked, but the basic idea is that you had an organism. This was really shocking. This is the a thin section. So here's the tube worm, and the tube worm, this is probably 10 centimeters here is the size of this bar here. So this is a section sliced out of the tube worm. This is that plume. So here's the red plume. So this is a section through that plume. And what scientists were pretty shocked to discover was that in the adult organisms, there's no remnant of a digestive system, no mouth, no gut, no excretion, no anus, nothing that would indicate that these organisms were taking in food, by filtering out particles the way other deep sea worms might do. It was a sort of a feverish couple of years before they figured out that the tube worms did possess this particular organism, a cell organ within their bodies. In fact, most of the mass of the tube worm inside the tube was comprised of this organ, which they called the trophosome. And the organ called the trophosome had these special cells, and living inside these cells were billions of bacteria. And these bacteria, it turned out, were chemoautotrophic bacteria. So they used the, turned out that what the vestimentiferans were able to do, vestimentiferan being a name given to the tube worms, what tube worms were able to do was to absorb sulfide compounds out of the fluids coming out of the hydrothermal vent, and to simultaneously absorb oxygen. And that's actually a pretty good trick, because typically speaking, H2S is very deadly for oxygen breathing, oxygen using organisms, because it causes hemoglobin to break down. But the tube worms have a specialized hemoglobin which can simultaneously and reversibly bind both H2S and oxygen. And so the tube worm performs this function of collecting the tube substrates, and then through a circulatory system, a very simple circulatory system, these substrate are presented to the bacteria. The bacteria utilize the two, combine the two components, the oxygen and the reduced hydrogen sulfide. And with the energy that they derive from that oxidation process, they're able to use the same Calvin-Benson cycle that green plants use. That's familiar to us from green plants and from blue-green algae to synthesize a new organic material. Perhaps I'll have a chance to talk more about this. This is a subject that I've worked on during my research, but it's a way in which we see sort of how during the early evolution of life, these kinds of obligate symbiotic relationships, and of course the tube worm cannot exist without its symbionts, and vice versa. The bacteria are unable to exist away from the tube worm. This is an example of how this came forward. Okay, so I see that we're at about time. So I think I had some more material to talk about in terms of humanity. I'm going to leave this material in the PowerPoint notes for today. But in order to get us into our breakout groups, I'm going to stop the lecture there. Is Denise present? Denise, are you here?
I am.
Okay, Denise, why don't you take a few minutes and go through. So I've asked Denise, or Denise actually volunteered, so thank you very much, Denise, to come and remind us that, as you're getting into your milestone 2 work and continuing on working on the project, it's going to become more and more important to make good use of scientific literature. So she's here to remind us that the library is a great resource for us, and that librarians are, we can have commensal relationships with librarians, that we can benefit from them, and they get to do their job. So Denise, please tell us how you can help the different teams to do their work.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. So hi again, everyone. I wanted to just come by, and this should be what your Canvas site looks like. And I wanted to share with you the resources that we actually, shared at the beginning of class. So if you remember all the way back in August, which seems so long ago now, but we can go into the modules section of your class, and you will see that we have in here our libraries, the introduction, along with the resources. So you can actually go and click on all of this, and it will help you kind of remember what we look through. It gives you also guides for how to search through the resources. We also, if you go down, and you're going to go down to kind of the bottom.
Yeah, it's all the way at the bottom. Yeah, there you go.
Yes. We have 2 modules that are specific for this class that it's super helpful. One is the Limnology and Oceanography Citations and Formatting module. So you have to start on that one on the first part, and it kind of just explains the topic and the module content. But if you move through with the next buttons at the bottom, it's again going to show you how to do those in-text citations. You're going to need to be able to do those for your upcoming project. You're going to need that probably more when you get into milestone 3. But for milestone 2, you're going to start with that bibliography, right? So this is showing you how to format all the different resources you're going to find, and how to kind of, there's a little like survey you can take that also can check to see if you're understanding that. Also, we have the module on using EndNote. So you'll see the EndNote online. We touched on this again at the beginning, or at the beginning of class. It was the end of August. And so this is really like well broken out, so you can see that this is how you create an account, and everything we went through, and we actually made sure we added these pictures on here so that you can kind of step through this whenever you're working on something. Last night I was working on something at 2 a.m., right? So I would have probably been on here looking through this. But then how, if you're using things like Web of Science or Google Scholar or the other databases, how you can get access. And you used some of this probably when you did that project worksheet back at the beginning of class. So we have all of these modules. They're open, they're available to you. It shows how to export your bibliography, because once you create a bibliography, you're going to want to be able to export that out of your EndNote online. We have creating groups, and how you can add everyone in your team into a group and then share the resources between y'all. So there's screenshots. It should be pretty helpful if you have questions or if you're having trouble finding anything. So I just want to make sure I got this. This is just some additional tips and tricks on using EndNote online. I wanted to let you know that Kelly and myself, we put an announcement in the Canvas site yesterday, but we are actually available to help today from Thursday. Today is Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. We're doing research office hours. So that's after this class is over. If your team is like having trouble finding resources, you're having trouble with those citations, if you're having trouble with EndNote, please come visit us today. If today doesn't work in this virtual Zoom space, and this is the link here and the link there, you can always email either Kelly or myself or both of us, and we're available. But we wanted to make sure that we had a space for you to come and actually ask those questions. So today, after class at 2, we actually have this virtual Zoom space you can get to from your announcements. And that's what I stopped by for.
Super. Thank you very much, Denise. People will have questions for you, but I suggest in order to move us along with things we want to do today that they wait until 2 o'clock to get with you. But you'll see in the assignment for today that you actually have to really start, putting citation next to the statements of fact that you make as you complete the essay and the writing and the research for today's in-class assignment. And so Denise can help you with that, on how to do that, where to look, and she's happy to do that. She's really good at it, because I've used her myself for that. So thank you, Denise, and we'll look forward to seeing you at 2. Typically what we do is we get back together and we have presentations and discussions after the breakout rooms are closed, and then I keep the Zoom open until 2 o'clock for additional discussion. People want to hang around. Nice. and go on. All right, so I'm going to put everybody into their breakout rooms, and if you don't get into a breakout room right away, please let me know where you need to be. So go ahead and join your breakout rooms, and then you've got the section part 2 of that assignment to carry on. Okay, so Darren, you go into Aquatic Junkies, yes?
Correct.
And Denise, you're not going to go into a room. Emily, where are you going? Remind me, please.
The Wayfinders.
Wayfinders. And Kate, you go to Team Tidal. And I should have this memorized by now. And Whitney, where are you going? Aquatic Junkies too?
Green Machine.
Green Machine, okay. And Carrie, so Claudia, do you need to be assigned somewhere?
Yes, please.
Where, please? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Turtle Protection Squad.
There you go.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Carrie, I unassigned you as co-host and then redesignated you co-host within the meeting. And so let's try again and see if that makes any difference. So I'll put you in the only clams and
Okay.
see how we do. And then see if you can, bounce around.
I will.
Did you not get in? Muted.
I did go in, but I came back out to see if I could move around, and I cannot.
Okay, well, I don't know what's going on with this. I mean, I talked to them and they say, oh, well, yeah, if you designate her and you put her in, she can move around. She can go out again, but she can't go anywhere else. All right, so go back and I will.
Should I be able to move from within the breakout room, or do I have to leave the room and come back here to?
When I go from room to room, I have to leave the breakout room
Oh.
and then rejoin the main section and then choose another breakout room.
Yeah.
But you don't.
I mean, I have the breakout rooms button, but when I click on it, it just gives me the one that you just assigned me to.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess we'll just carry on here. Yeah, Delaney, do you need to be in a breakout room? Delaney, split. Okay. Well, let's. Hello, Beaches, how are you doing?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you're not going to be able to finish everything here, but try to, in case when we get back together in about 15 minutes, try to have some, bullet points prepared to talk about in case you get called on, okay? And then you'll finish the actual writing assignment today, working together, all right? Hello, clams. I see that there's only, you have 6 participants. It showed fewer. So there you have everybody from your team is present, or most people are there?
Yes, I believe so. I think one is out.
Okay, but that person told you ahead of time, hey, I have to miss. So
Yes.
yeah, okay. Well, that's all I want to make sure that, that we're not having absentee problems. Folks who don't come up and leave their teammates kind of in the lurch to do the work for them. Okay, I'm going to leave, and I guess, Carrie, I'll put you somewhere as well.
Okay.
Hello, homeboys. Is everything going okay?
Yes.
So you're missing some folks. Did they let you know ahead of time that they were going to be absent?
Well, one person in our group, Alicia, she can never make it to lectures.
I see.
So she did let us know at the beginning of the year, but she hasn't made it to any lecture now.
Huh. So is she participating in these in-class assignments, or is she letting you guys do that? So if somebody can't come to lecture, they can't do the breakout work, and then they, there's a 20-point assignment that's happening every week. Is this person who's not able to come to lecture participating in that or helping you with that work? I feel that there's reluctance to rat out your fellow student, but I'd like to know, because if somebody can't come to class, they shouldn't be taking the class. I mean, they can't come to lecture at all, because this is a synchronous lecture. Okay. Well, can you tell me who that student is, please? And I'm not going to punish them or anything, but I want to talk to them about trying to come to some arrangement. So who is the student that can't come to class?
Her name is Alicia.
Alicia?
Yes, sir. I'm not sure what her last name is.
Okay.
I think it's Mason, maybe.
Mason? All right, well, I'll talk to her. I mean, I can understand if people have problems making it to class, but it's not fair to make your teammates do all the work and not help, because I mean, I am assigning work that people have to do here, and it's really not fair if somebody is just getting a free ride on that. So I'll talk to Alicia. Okay, and to try to get some bullet points together for when we rejoin the main session, so we can have a discussion about it. Okay.
Sounds good.
I accidentally hit leave meeting instead of leave room. So can you reassign me? But I think I have the breakout room button inside of the meeting, so I can move around that way. And you're muted.
She didn't automatically do that. I'm always forgetting it. All right, I'll put you into the Aquanaut.
So I think it was working, and then I left the meeting instead of the room.
Okay.
So I'll try it again.
Okay, so you can join the Aquanauts now. Hello.
Hello
How are you doing?
there.
Planeteers.
It's going well enough.
Okay, and you got everybody present, or not everybody's present? I'm trying to not crack down, but help people out to make sure that they attend class and help out their team. So if you have folks that are absent, and I guess there should be 5 or 6 of you anyway. So if anybody's absent, did they let you know ahead of time?
No.
It did not. But we haven't really been having issues with people not doing their fair share of work.
Yeah.
All right. So as long as you can work it out, I'm not trying to, micromanage how your team works, but I do want to step in if there's somebody who's really sort of taking a free ride and taking advantage of his or her teammates. So, okay. So not a lot of time, but go ahead and sort of pick out some big themes about all this, and be prepared to discuss when we get back together. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Hello, Green Machine. How are you doing? Oh,
Good.
good. All right. So, and everybody present, you're able. So just put together some kind of bullet points on this, and then you'll write them out in greater detail after class, and then they're due tonight, of course, just like always. Assignment. All right.
Okay.
Questions? And do think about, unless you're really feeling really confident with the citation, it would be a good idea for at least one team member to check in with Denise and get some pointers on using the citation and the citation software, because that'll make life easier for you, particularly when you get into the milestone 2 work. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Would you mind typing those out under the question? I can't
Yeah,
seem to
yeah,
find them
yeah.
online.
I'm about to copy and paste them.
Okay, cool. And then I'll get started working on them, or one of them.
Hello, Fathoms. Everything going okay?
Hello.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hello, yes. We're all working on a Google Drive document.
great. And I would really advise you to take advantage of Denise either today or at some other point, and get some pointers. You don't have, the whole team doesn't have to attend, but if somebody can go there and then explain to the others, how to use EndNote and things like that, it really, really help you, to do your citation correctly and with minimal effort.
Okay.
All right.
Can you make me the co-host again?
Oh, yeah, let's see. So you were it says that you're a co-host. All right, let me unmake you co-host and then I'll,
No, it didn't say that before.
well, you should be co-host automatically by virtue of, the fact that I designate you as an alternate host.
All right.
But what I did before was to switch off the co-host and then put it back on again from within the meeting. And maybe there's some kind of magic that happens there. So let me do that, and why don't you see if you can move around, all right? Okay, so now you're not a host. And magically you're back to co-host again. All right,
Okay, so now I'm going to join my breakout room and then see if I can join others from there.
okay, so you're going to go into the aquatics, aquanauts. That's
Yeah.
where you assign. Okay. Hello, aquatic junkies.
Hello.
Hey.
So you only have 3 people present.
Okay, we only have 3 today.
Okay, so the people who aren't here let you know that they couldn't be present, and so they could figure out, how they can help with this project?
No, sir, we were going to reach out after the fact, but no, we didn't know that they weren't going to be here today.
Okay, well, you can feel free to invoke my name. You can say that, Dr. McDonald was concerned that, you were missing and hadn't let the team know when you reach out.
Yes, sir. We'll let them know that you dropped by the group and happened to only see 3 of us.
Yeah, that's a good strategy, and that I was concerned about that.
Yes, sir.
I'm not concerned for you guys, but I'm concerned for folks who are not, pulling their weight with their team. It's totally fine if somebody has to miss a class, but it's not, as long as they help people out and they figure out a way. All right?
Yes, sir. Well, we're going to reach out and have them participate in the second question. We've done the first question of all 4 parts of it.
Okay.
I think we have good answers, so we're going to ask them to complete the second one and then turn in the assignment tomorrow. And if we haven't heard back, then obviously there'll be a little bit of an issue, but
okay,
we'll let you know. I'm sure they're fine. They always participated in the past, so
okay,
I'm sure they have excuses.
good. Nothing like excuses. See ya.
Dr. McDonald,
Yes.
for number 2, are you just asking for what the changes are? And like when it's asking for how would consideration of ecosystem services change the calculation of cost benefit, is
Yeah.
it like asking how would the consideration of the changes change like the cost benefit?
Yeah, well, I mean, cost and benefit are sort of like, oh, what's the benefit? So specifically, ecosystem services are a benefit that, pretty often doesn't get credited. So, we're getting all like, mangroves or, coastal zones or beaches or whatever. And people say, well, or wetlands is the classic example. Well, we should just be able to drain the wetlands and, develop real estate as we like. The problem is that you lose the benefit of functioning wetlands because they provide, clean water, flood control, biodiversity, recreation, etc. So that was what I was looking for is, when they do that, what's your, how does that change things?
Okay.
Make
Thank
sense?
you.
Okay, so we're getting back together. Is all the breakout rooms closed? Pretty much, I guess. All right, so you saw the questions there for the second part of this exercise. So I wanted you specifically, and I think, I think the research into how the different calculation of ecosystem services and the change to the Endangered Species Act, et cetera, that's something that you may have to delve into a little bit more deeply. But what about Florida? So what are the different kinds of ecosystem services that we are classified? There's provisioning, creation, et cetera. So what about Florida? What are some examples of ecosystem services that we get in Florida? And I'm going to ask the my team chooser here, spinning the wheel, and it stops at the big green machine. So the green machine team members should please log on or start up your video and tell us, give us some examples of ecosystem services in Florida and what category that they fall into. So what have you got, machine? You're all muted.
So I think we did the wrong one when we found like the ecosystem services. Like we went through and we did like the forest, the dry land, the island stuff, and we did like what that offers to Florida. So we can go over some of those, but we didn't do like the actual like ones we were supposed to.
Okay. All right. So yeah, what I was looking for was, I wasn't making it too challenging, but I wanted you to, look at provisioning and all of the different kinds of services that were specified, classes of specified, and then think of examples in Florida where functioning ecosystems provide services to Floridians that they benefit from. So why don't you just, can you briefly tell us, what you found about and what you were able to do?
I mean, we just did like mangroves, for example, like are great. They help to protect our coasts and ecosystems, like keep the sand like in place, like on the beaches and stuff. And then just like the things like the inland water allows for the smaller, younger fish to like grow and thrive in a safer environment than being out in the ocean and just stuff like that.
Okay. All right. But that's not a benefit to human society, is it? That's a sort of an ecosystem function as opposed to a service that humanity enjoys. So the protecting of the coast, that's something that can benefit coastal communities. So that was specifically what I was looking for. Did any other team come up with that? Or should I call on a different team?
We have an example of provisioning that we mentioned. So pertaining to a particular mountain in Lake County, Sugarloaf Mountain in the 1920s through 1940s, grapes and other citrus groves were able to be placed there, which allowed humans to be satisfied with having food.
Okay, and so what is the ecosystem that was providing that service?
The mountain.
Mountain? There was a mountain in Florida?
Yes.
So what kind of ecosystem was it? Not sure. Sort of coastal forest or dry land or what?
Well, the way that it was shown on the map, it was like in the central part of Florida. So I would say inland.
Okay.
Maybe
All right,
a marsh.
It was a marshland, all right. And is it still a marshland? I mean, is it still functioning as a marsh and, after it became a provisioning place, or was that?
The environment diminished, like what I was reading, it messed up purposely, permanently due to like the heavy stripping of vegetation. So the environment changed, but I'm trying to see like present day how it is now.
Okay. All right, well, thanks. Let me call on a different team then. All right, Can't Fathom. Can't Fathom. Are you there, Can't Fathom?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, so why don't you go ahead and activate your microphones. And what did you learn? What sort of Florida ecosystems provide ecosystem services that benefit Floridians? And it's important to note that the idea is that the ecosystem continues to function, in something like its natural state, and that we benefit from that, as opposed to an ecosystem that you pave over to make a parking lot or something like that. Obviously, it doesn't continue to function. So did you come up with anything? Can't Fathom? Can't Fathom. I'm not hearing anything from you.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to get my dog to quiet down before I turn my mic on.
Okay. Did any of your team members help out?
You're asking on number 1, right?
Yes, I'm asking on number 1.
So I didn't write this, and that's the only reason I wasn't speaking up, but one of the ecosystems that we said was the Everglades, and we'd be able to, we use that in many different ways. And what we wrote is, you can have a lot of schools, learn educational things from the Everglades, and these sort of environments can be very educational if you're close to them and you're able to, really use them.
Okay, so that comes under the category of what, sort of spiritual, educational, recreational benefit?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other examples? All right. Well, we'll leave it there. I'll call on a different team. About the Wayfinders. Wayfinders, are you here? Hello, Wayfinders.
Hi, we're here.
Okay, what do you got, Wayfinders?
Were you asking about question 1?
Yes, question 1.
Okay, well, again, I didn't write this. I was working on the second question. So if there's anyone in my group that did question 1 wants to speak up, or else I can just read it. But they talk about how the provisioning services are direct products from our ecosystem, and they benefit Florida in ways with our aquatic ecosystem. They provide goods and services, and then the regulating services. Oh yeah, okay. And then the regulating services are processes that work together to make sure ecosystems are clean, sustainable, and functional. These benefit Florida through water quality, such as water purification. Another important benefit that this service provides is the control of flooding in Florida's coastal areas.
Okay, so what is the ecosystem that you're talking about? Because this sounds good. I mean, you're getting at exactly the sort of services, but what's the ecosystem?
I didn't write it, so I don't know if someone wants to step forward. I was just reading what our group had.
Can somebody else rescue Mackenzie?
Sorry.
Wait, what do you mean by ecosystem?
Well, for example, a mangrove area is a coastal ecosystem. A wetland is a coastal ecosystem. A longleaf pine forest is an ecosystem.
Oh, for the regulating services, I meant to talk about the mangroves for the coastal areas.
Okay, great. So regulating services would be, and then, what is the service? The service is a coastal protection, preservation, etc.
Yeah, control of flooding.
Control of flooding. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I'm looking for, for question 1, are to name a specific ecosystem, and you don't have to describe it in great detail, but, enough so that we understand what you're talking about, that occurs in Florida. So, what are the ecosystems that you would expect to find in Florida? Dunes, there are lots. And, what do we derive by letting them continue to exist as ecosystems? So that's the real concept here, because you can develop anything. You can go in and cut down the forest and make a golf course, and you have a golf course, but you don't have a forest anymore. And so you get the benefits of the golf course, but you lose the benefits of the forest. Well, what are the benefits of the forest? And so that sort of speaks to the question number 2, is what happens, if you leave out ecosystem services from trying to analyze the cost benefit of a regulatory action. Does that make sense? Okay. Mary, you've raised your hand. Mary Noonan.
Yes, I have a question real quick. For regulating, would Florida's non-allowance of fracking and drilling in the Gulf be a regulatory process? I don't know what ecosystem it would. I mean, I know it prevents the beaches from and keeps tourism alive by protecting the beaches.
Manufacturer's warranty. We sent you several notices in the mail that you have yet to extend your warranty.
Sorry, my phone.
That's okay.
Don't forget to extend your warranty, Dr. McDonald.
It's the people who invented robocalls there should be a special place in hell for those people. So,
all the time.
Stopping fracking is an example of regulating a human activity, and so that's a regulation in the sense of a law or a practice that limits what we can do or puts special circumstances and requirements on some action that people would want to do. So, an example of a regulation would be, okay, you're not allowed to disturb, ecosystems, or you're not allowed to damage the watershed. And fracking, affects the natural system in a number of different ways. It damages the underlying geology by breaking down the limestone, karsts and things and it can lead to sinkholes and many other things. And then the fracking fluids, some of them are re-injected, but if you re-inject fracking fluids into the Florida aquifers, then that fluid can spread to a lot of different areas. And so the places where they want to do fracking are down in fairly near the Everglades. So one could be really concerned about fracking as damaging, potentially the watershed. So if you wanted to make a ecosystem service argument against fracking, how would you do that? See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So looks like we've run out of time. I'll keep talking here. Are there anybody else want to ask? We've got time until the top of the hour. Does anybody want to ask questions about this or have examples of what you found in these to answer question 1 or question 2? Hannah, yes. You're muted.
We did for like cultural. I used an example from like when I was in middle school. Every year we would go on a trip to Big Cypress Preserve.
Right.
To like we would test like the water's pH and stuff like that. Would the benefit that we derive from that just be simply education and like field experience?
Sure, that works.
Okay. And what was it? Is there anything else that we would have to put, or is it just like the benefit that we derive from that?
I think if you just describe carefully and completely, how you benefit from that. But if you're thinking about sort of the existence, the Big Cypress continuing to exist, I mean, the cultural part of that is a sort of a heritage. So if someday you have children, you would like to take them to Big Cypress, just like you did, right?
Right. Okay.
Eventually. So, that's kind of a cultural heritage, right? And so that's, to be able to, to show young people, the beauty of nature and, all the interesting things that are happening in different ecosystems, that is definitely a cultural benefit. It's one of those things where it's hard to put a dollar value on it. So what's that worth, to you? And environmental economics struggles with that process evaluation. So one way that they do that, for example, if they're trying to figure out what is the benefit of Big Cypress continuing to exist, well, economists would come in and they'd say, well, how much money are people willing to spend to go have this experience, like in your case, this educational experience at Big Cypress? Well, they're willing to spend time, they're willing to, drive there, maybe stay overnight in a local hotel, buy, so there's a whole series of expenses that you're willing to pay to have that experience. And so that's a way to put a dollar value on it. But it's very challenging. In many cases, because we get these services for free, and if you're getting something for free, maybe it isn't really worth anything. So, does anybody else have examples of what about provisioning? What kind of provisioning ecosystems are there?
Oh, I was actually going to add on, or say that I actually found an article that does, it was written in 2005, but it does try to quantitatively analyze the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act. And what they've come up with is that species recovery is not necessarily assessed as it really should be. And it basically should suggest that it's going to take over $150 million just to access the backlog, just to even get the data, previous data. So you can actually really put it into perspective of how much it would actually cost for, other bigger projects, but it still doesn't effectively assess ecosystem services as quantitative data, because again, you said that it was really hard, but it does give a perspective into how much money small projects would be cost, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that can be difficult, sort of regulatory services, and I was thinking that maybe somebody would come up with the example of harmful algal blooms. So, if you have a pristine coastal environment, where the water has high water quality. There's not a lot of, septic farms that are putting nutrients and sewage and effluents into the water. You're less likely to have harmful algal blooms. And so you get the benefit of this marine ecosystem, which can be important for tourism. It can be important for fishing. It can be important for quality of life, property values, and so forth. All that comes from, the healthy coastal ecosystem. And, so you can express it in terms of provisioning, resource values, etc. But a lot of times the value of ecosystem services becomes apparent when something gets in the way, when you're not getting that service anymore. So when you get a harmful algal bloom as a result of negligent sewage processing, or you have other degradation of the water quality because of that, then all of a sudden, the access to fresh water or the ability to swim in clean water at Wakulla Springs is suddenly called into question. And so, a lot of times we discover the value of ecosystem services when we're deprived of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Also, I had a question. I mean, this might be a little political, but I read, the New York Times article that came out I read the entire article, and they talk about one of President Trump's New York estates. I think it's called the Seven Spring Estates. And it talks about how since he didn't build a huge plaza or anything, people were complaining about the water quality that would have caused, if he had built the plaza, how it would have damaged the actual ecosystem and the resources that are available to the other residents. And so he wrote that off as a charity. And I was just wondering if that is actually with causing, giving a cost of ecosystem services, would that actually be heightened when it comes to business capitalism?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think probably we know now that President Trump has a genius for, the tax code.
Yeah.
But it's kind of jaw-dropping to think that somebody could claim a write-off for not developing something.
Right.
And that's a charitable contribution. But, it is kind of an interesting application of the ecosystem service concept. So Trump is saying, I'm going to let you continue to have this ecosystem service. And, in return for doing that, I'm suffering a business loss that I can write off on my taxes. So,
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I didn't even know you could do that personally. I
don't know that you actually can do that, but
yeah,
he did it. So apparently, I don't know the story. But the Seven Springs, yeah, that's the one where that's their family estate or something, when he claimed that it was a business.
Until, business, right.
Yeah, well, but they did, there was a discussion of, climate change and, the benefit of functioning ecosystems during the presidential debate.
I know, I was thinking about you, actually. I was surprised.
Well, I was watching carefully, and I was pleased that Chris Wallace brought that up, because it wasn't originally on the list of topics for the debate. And, it's too bad that it couldn't have been, explored in a more rational way. Even
they just blew it off.
Yeah, I just totally blew it off and didn't engage with it at all. And I kind of wish that, that Biden hadn't spent quite so much time talking about, the benefits of a green economy, and spent more time talking about the risks of just letting climate change continue unabated. But, he did get there. Biden got there. And, Trump also sort of expressed his, complete dismissal of the concept of climate change and said, well, everything is forest management.
Yeah.
That upset me too, because
it's weird, actually.
Very frustrated. I was thinking about what you said about how they hadn't talked about it, and I was like, oh my God, they're talking about it. And then he's like, oh, it's just they can handle it down in Brazil like this, so we can too. It's like, oh my God,
I know, it really weird.
what it is, and the whole world isn't the same, and the climate across the world isn't the same, and the dirt isn't the same. It's all different.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a frustrating experience, but at least the climate is now on the picture, and it is an issue. Not as big an issue as I would like, but it's still there. So maybe people will consider that when they go to vote.
Mhm. I think maybe the blame, maybe next, because that's where I felt with Trump when he was saying, oh, well, the forest needs to be more managed. It's like he was almost blaming the actual management services, like the act, which is kind of funny because they're all regulated by government. So
Yeah,
it was
well,
a very weird.
yeah, 57% of the forest land in California is federal land.
Mhm.
So if he wanted to have people send people out to prevent forest fires by sweeping the forest floors, which is
Right.
No,
I just hope
okay. You've had
I just hope it
years.
comes back up.
Yeah, you've
I
had
hope it
years.
comes back up in the next debate or something, and I hope that's not the end of it.
Mhm.
Because I was happy when they touched on it. But
They need a mute function in these debates so we can have clear-cut conversations, to be
They
honest.
do need a
Oh,
mute button. I was thinking about like an online format, where, okay, your turn to talk, and then when you finish your 2 minutes, you get
Just
muted.
mute 'em.
You just mute
Yeah.
yourself.
And then you have to raise your hand, and then the moderator calls on you, kind of like.
But allowing them to duke it out like this lets us see them and how they choose to be with each other. So it's kind of good.
I don't know. I think that's
You know,
not
someone-
that benefit's not enough. I still think.
Well, how would you know if one of them is a jackass if you can't watch them be a jackass?
Yeah, but we're supposed to get a look at 4 years of their presidency in this debate. That's the point. We're supposed
And
to
you see how childish they're acting.
I also think that
Gives you like a
it made, at least for me, it made me want to turn off the debate, and I probably missed on a lot of information that I wish I would have been given by them, just because they were bickering at each other rather than focusing on talking about their policies and what they were going to do. And I feel like saying the important things, which is what us as the public want to know.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of thought that, maybe they should have suspended the debate, when it was apparent that people were not able to follow the rules. Frankly, mostly Trump refusing to, let Biden answer. But if they had suspended the debate at that point early on and said, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to do this, then, Trump would never have revealed his, disdain for the white supremacists, and that made the famous, stand back and stand by comment, which is kind of dispositive of his racial attitudes and important to know. And also his whole take on the fraudulent election, which is really, really concerning. So the jackass so that is, it turns out to be kind of important there. But I would have rather had an actual debate, an actual discussion with information and, different policy philosophies would have been much more presidential.
Yeah, I was looking into actually just 20 years ago when you had the Kerry versus Bush debate, and I was just watching it on YouTube and just seeing the difference that 16 years has made for just verbal debating. I was in debate in like high school, and you're taught to, kind of rebuttal and respond to what the person said, but in a respectful manner, because you want your audience to understand. You're not necessarily for bashing or your opponent or anything. It's for your audience. So I don't know.
To be fair, I don't think there was much respect on either side. It was very evident.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But I mean, respecting the format and respecting the, Presidential Debate Commission and respecting the audience was also part of it. And I thought at least Biden, I wish Biden had been a little bit more restrained, although you have to be a saint, to not react to somebody yelling at you and you're trying to answer a difficult question.
For sure.
And so I wish Biden had kind of been a little bit more focused, because I guess I probably obvious I don't favor Trump, but it was just so unfortunate for the process of people, understanding what we're going to get from this choice. That,
Do you mean like when he was saying like you're the worst president we've ever had? Like those little like smart remarks. I also wish that he would have been able to restrain himself from just saying those things, because I felt like it didn't make him look as powerful as he could have. Whereas if you don't go down to their level, you look stronger.
Yeah, I do. But I mean, the aggression was, coming from the other side was so overwhelming. I mean,
I agree. It's definitely hard.
It would be really hard. But I bet you next time, he's going to be more restrained, and I bet Trump will be more restrained in the town hall format.
I agree. It made them both look pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my opinion, one of them looked worse than the others. But
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
I mean, I was saying earlier, I was saying that, like, I think it was interesting to see Trump's diction because, with the Green New Deal being brought up, I really do believe he wanted Biden to be on camera saying something like that, to, for an ad next.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? I feel like some of the questions you can read, or some of the responses and the diction that he brings up, you can actually truly see like his manipulation and what is going on.